today it's my privilege to introduce the session. We have 5, I'm going to call them onliners here. They will be presenting just a little bit of what they're doing. And what I'd like to do is give you an overview of who our presenters are, kind of what the order is, and kind of the format we're going to use for this. As you can imagine, going between 5 people with technology all at the same time is going to be a little challenge, but I think we'll do okay with it. But what we're going to do is, first of all, hear from Peggy in the comm department, and she's going to really talk about the idea of building community, and especially kind of using visual images to build community. And then we're going to switch over to Bob, and Bob's going to work through a little bit of the Google Suites, Google Suite of tools that can be used, and then he's going to be talking about design and facilitation of forums. Following that, we'll have Jessica from the comm department too, really talking about individual and group presentations in an online environment. And then Fred's going to join us with thoughts about designing assignments, providing feedback online. Then he's also going to show kind of repeating structures, how those can be used in an online environment. And then Carole's going to finish off with, I think, a very interesting presentation on running labs in an online environment. So what's going to happen in terms of format, each presenter is going to have roughly 3 to 4 or 5 minutes or so to present, and then following their presentation, they're going to show and tell. Following their presentation, we'll have a time for questions you might have about the presenter, but also a time for you to interject some comments too. We've got a good-sized group here, and I know we do have some very experienced people in the online world, so that's a chance you might add some of your comments too. So a brief presentation, a little Q&A. While that Q&A is happening, the next person is going to get geared up for their presentation. So that's how we'll progress through it. Right at the end, if we have a little bit of time, extra time, we can use it for questions too. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start off with Peggy then.
So I think we all know that nonverbal communication is an important piece of communication and teaching. And in the classroom, we use nonverbal communication to establish immediacy, right? That sort of thing that says, I see you, I care about you, that kind of thing. But how do you do that when it's asynchronous online communication? And I think the real key to this is using images whenever you can, and video. And there's been a number of studies done recently that talk about the impact of putting your face onto a lecture, a PowerPoint lecture, when you put it online. And what that does is it gives you the opportunity to use immediacy. And some of the studies show that there's very little difference in the ultimate educational outcomes, but what it has shown is that students prefer to see people talking. And they also suggest that they prefer things that they're more comfortable with, which means as more and more people are using video on online classes, students are going to come to expect that. And I'm afraid that in the next year or two, the online lectures that don't have video components to them, students are going to feel more and more like it's sort of a stark form of communication. So what I'd like to do is just show you a couple of things that I've done. So first of all, with my lectures, where did my lectures go? Oh, there they are. I'll just give you a sample of a lecture. Just throwing my face on there in the corner someplace is easy peasy, especially if you use, I found that QuickTime is a really easy way to put this, to put your face in there. I, of course, don't like to do many fun things, and so I've used Camtasia, which allows me to move the box around and put arrows in and things like that. But so just using my face, I think, adds this extra component to the online portion of it. One of the other things that I like to do to try and create this presence in my classes, whenever I go on vacation, I try and do at least one lecture on location. So what that does is it helps them feel like I'm sharing a little bit of my life with them. So, for instance, I'm talking about this idea of occasion and how technology is changing. Because all those people down at the wedding were on their cell phones. How weird is that? So putting these little things in there, I think, does create a feeling of community and presence in the online class. The other thing I do is I have students also include images of themselves whenever possible. So, for instance, in one of the classes, it's a class on culture, and so what I want them to do is to explain their own culture, where they've come from. And I did this for the first time this last summer, and it was amazing. I'll give you an example of what mine looks like. All of a sudden I saw my students. And I know it's not supposed to make that big of a difference, but I knew who they were, and it changed the whole feeling of community and presence in that classroom, and they saw each other. So this is an example of an assignment where they introduce each other using images. I've also done things like, instead of a reaction paper or reaction post, I have them do a reaction video, because then all of a sudden they see each other. I have them take me on a tour of their house or outside, or one of the things we look at is the impact of, in a fast food joint, the impact of certain architectural details on kind of the way communication happens. So they take me on a little tour of the fast food joint that they're at, kind of doing this little thing. And what I've come to see is that students are very adept at doing video. I'm not sure that's true for adult students, but they're good at videotaping themselves, and by having images of themselves as part of the course, it really enhances this feeling of presence, of community, and makes use of some of those nonverbal sorts of cues that we might not otherwise have. So, any questions? All right, so who's next? Question. So while I'm answering those questions, we should have the next person come up. Is that how we're doing this?
Are all your students adept? Because some of mine are not, I know.
Yeah. So some students. Yes. That's a really good point. There are some students who are not good at taking a video of themselves with their cell phone or getting it up to YouTube. I think ever since we moved to the YouTube thing that we've been using on Moodle, I haven't had any trouble yet. Students seem to know how to put things onto YouTube, which I don't know is a little scary for me, but I haven't had a lot of trouble. But you're right, putting together a little tutorial on how to do a video, how to get a video from your cell phone up to YouTube, things like that. I think it's really helpful.
We've already done that in Confluence.
And you've already done it. Is it a video of you talking?
No, it's a tutorial how to do the phone, how to upload to YouTube, all those things. So.
But it doesn't have my pretty face on there. I'm talking to my students.
I'll come and take a picture of you then.
Are you sure you want that?
Yeah.
Where is it at?
Just go to Confluence and search for digital video creation.
Okay.
It doesn't have putting your picture in your PowerPoint, but
And I also put arrows sometimes.
yeah, well.
Great.
Hi. Thanks, Peggy. So you better look at the clock here. Okay. 5 minutes. And Jay tasked me with looking at a couple different areas. One was to look a little bit at forums, because Jay is very big on designing forums and asking the right questions of your students so you can get them involved. I didn't tell him that I didn't really have the answer, so I'll tell him now. So, okay. So I really, as I was thinking about this, I use forums extensively because it's like Peggy was talking, it's a way to build community in an online course. If you can design a forum, get your students talking to each other, it's really critical. So they become involved, they take ownership. In fact, in the course I teach, it's called Transforming Technology, the students say it's the best feature in the course because they really do get involved. And really I take a look at 3 facets that I try and get to do. One, and I got the 3 I's, the 3 points. To invite, inform, and involve. And really the invite is really how you design your forum so you really make it a welcoming place for them. And then the second is how do you inform them what their responsibilities are? And then how do they really get involved? And I just want to show a little bit. And I practice this on my Mac, so I'm not sure it's going to work on a PC. So I have links I could go to. So I may just show. So anyway, one of the ways I inform them is what they're supposed to do is through a good rubric. So actually a rubric is built in. This is a K category, so it's a K category outcomes that I teach you to. As I tell them, and then here's the results I get. This is last week's discussion, actually, and you can see they're talking about this. They're talking about leisure technology and how to transform that in a technological world. And I give them some examples of good posts and get in as well, so I model the behavior I expect to be there. And then they just jump in and talk about the week's materials. And it's just a marvelous set of discussions. And this is an example of one of last week's posts by a student. And they like Peggy students. These students are very video oriented. They like to find TED Talks and other things that really demonstrate kind of the themes for the week. It's really kind of a great scenario. Okay, so that's forums. So hold on to your questions on that. Because mainly what I wanted to talk about was using Google tools. Because maybe like some of you, Moodle can be frustrating in the tools that it has. So how many people have used the Moodle Wiki? How many people have been frustrated by the Moodle Wiki? Okay, that was my problem. So I looked for some other solutions, and I really did quite a bit of research this time around to do that. So the first thing I wanted to do is I had an assignment that I actually wanted students to build a wiki page. And they have an individual component and a common collaborative component. So wikis are great for that because they're collaborative, and then you have your own wiki page as well. So I did a research and found out, well, how can I do this in Google? And everybody said Google Sites is the way to do this. So this essentially is the instructions I gave the students. And I won't show my previous Moodle wiki. And then this is the wiki that I ended up with. Let's see if I can do it. Open this up. And here's the Google site wiki, essentially there. So essentially I see achieve kind of, here's my wiki, my common table, students can jump in. And the nice thing about this, one of the limitations of the Moodle wiki is only one person can be in it at a time. They can all be in this at a time. So it's no limitation at all. In this case, they can also have all their individual pages, and I can set them up in the order I want them to be, and then they can put in their different components. So, and it's very flexible. They know how to use it because they know how to use Google Docs. So it just works. It's really nice. The other thing I like to do is, because it's the K course, it has an analytic component. They're supposed to should demonstrate how to do analysis in math, because it's kind of that science component of the math that's left over. So I essentially have a common Google sheet that I have them work on to collect some data, and then I also give them an Excel template to do their own data. So they do their own data, they then transfer this to a common Google sheet, and I'll show that sheet here. So there's their individual data. They just enter from their sheet that they've collected, and they're collecting this for 7 days, all the data that they do throughout the day. And then they're writing a summary paragraph here, and scroll down here. Yeah. At the bottom is this collaborative graph, and as they're filling in, as they're filling it in, it automatically updates with their data. So they go back to the slideshow. I got it back there. So essentially, that's the last week's data for the 27 students that are there, with how they're spending their time, and finding out that, lo and behold, they spend a lot of their time doing things with technology that they really hadn't thought about in the past. Another thing that I like to do is I like to involve students in building my lectures, because I don't like to lecture. So, especially online, it gives them ownership of the resources that they're doing. So in this particular assignment, they're building their lecture, and this is done in a Google slide environment. So if I open up the Google slide environment, here's what it looks like. And as soon as it loads, you can see here's, I can quickly go through the different slides that they've developed, and it's marvelous work. Much more than I could put together ever in a given lecture, looking at this case in terms of sustainable technology in the classroom, how technology can be transformative using education. And then the final piece is using Google Docs as a collaborative environment. And again, I do this quite a bit. And here's an example. I want to show two things with this one. Here's a sample of one group's pages. That's not going to work. Oh well. Anyway, it's here. It's here anyway. But the nice thing about this is if you've ever done anything in Moodle, it's hard to tell who did what. The nice thing about Google is you have a complete revision history. It not only shows you who was involved, but when they were involved and exactly what they did. So it's a really critical tool for looking at student activity. And I've never had a problem. The students just do it. Maybe it's the accountability, maybe it's just they're familiar with the tool. It's great. A little past my thing. Questions?
What thing was a wiki?
That was all different Google tools.
Different Google
Yeah,
sources.
so
Wiki was part.
Google Wiki, Google Sites, Google Pages. Any other questions?
I think everything that you're hearing about today, it's coming fast, okay? It's coming very quick. But I know that every one of our presenters today would be more than happy just to sit with you and talk and kind of show you and, get you walking through things. And, we've got Matt here today. Matt, just stand up. If you don't know this guy, tremendous resource. And then Scott Strand, too, any kind of media stuff especially. And Carole Wicklund, stand up too. A lot of people don't know you. But these folks are all there to really help, and everybody presenting. So if something is intriguing to you, just talk to them, and they can get you rolling with it.
Thanks. I'm technology free except for my notes on my iPad, so I won't have anything fancy to show, but I think I've got some great ideas anyway. I teach a public speaking class online, which I think is sort of ironic because most people are either against that. There's a lot of people within the field that would argue that it's not something that should be happening, but I found some great benefits for my students to the point where with some of the things that I've been doing in my online speaking classes, I've actually adapted to my in-class. This was the first semester I had my students record themselves independently of me and then to go through the same process that my online students do. We're just now doing our first set of face-to-face speeches, and let me tell you, it's the best set of persuasive speeches I've ever had my students do. What's been gained, in my honest opinion, is a self-reflection that goes deeper than them thinking back to the process. They actually had to watch themselves. They couldn't get around it with the way that I set the online class up versus the face-to-face class. They had to watch other students. The rule was that they had to watch themselves, watch 5 other students, and then create parallels. Where did they all struggle? Where is improvement needed? Where are those strengths? And I found that there's been more reflection. Those areas of struggle previously were fixed once they got to the face-to-face. So I was really excited about that and look forward to using another course to see if that's something that continues. One of the biggest things that I've learned, and we've had this idea of technology come through again and again and again, is that I've limited what they can use for technology. I think in online courses we get this idea in our head that we have to use all of these different formats and all of these different online structures. And one of the things that becomes difficult for the students is not only do they have to learn the content, the structure, and the format of the assignment, they're also having to learn a format of technology as well. And so what I've done is limited to somehow those speeches need to be uploaded to YouTube. Sometimes they'll try to use other formats. My goal is keep it simple and keep it focused. I'm not concerned about your technology prowess, I'm concerned about your speaking prowess. The other thing that I've learned is that For the group presentations, to try to duplicate what happens in the classroom with groups, the one-on-one interaction that they receive, is that I've had to build some of that into assignments. The way that my group presentations work now, my students have to work on some social justice issue, whatever it is that's intriguing to them. They start by having to write opinion papers, which is always really fascinating because a lot of students are like, I don't think I have an opinion on this topic. Sure you do. Somebody has influenced you on this. You've read something, you've experienced something. What those papers do, they help to facilitate a discussion that should happen in the classroom, but it might not even happen in the classroom because sharing opinions, especially on social justice issues, I think can be really scary for students. They're forced to talk about something that might have a little bit of controversy in it. And so by first writing through those opinions, and then they all have to go back and dialogue on them. Second, they have to go and write research papers. So at this point in time, they've split up who's doing what on the presentation. They have the research conversation. Again, they have a 500-word limit, and then they have to read, respond, and interact again. And ultimately what they do is they put together a synchronous presentation with me. We work to collaborate on a time, and we do it using Google Hangout. One of the things that becomes really interesting is that students tell me about how they practiced on Google Hangout before I get there, and it becomes a way for them to really hone in on a skill that's going to be so important for their careers. I always tell them, suddenly when somebody asks you for your job, do you think you can do presentations? Do you think you'll be fine with Skype interviews? You'll be working remotely? My students are like, yeah, I've already done that actually. I've worked and rehearsed working with a group, working with really difficult topics and then putting those ideas together. It's really interesting to see. I can tell that they've practiced together. I'll start to notice the little interactions that they do online. The way that they'll watch how each other reacts, more so than they would even in a group presentation. Sometimes in a group presentation, we've all seen them, a student will tell a joke and then the other group members clearly have tuned out for a little bit and didn't catch on to it. I find that in the Google Hangout, all of a sudden they all smile at the same time. They've actually rehearsed it because of that technology component. And so I'm finding that I feel like I'm talking myself out of in-class presentations here. But what I found is that it's really forcing them to go through that revising process in the speaking component more so than they do with just the revising of the actual speeches. And so I find that to be one of the biggest gains. They revise, obviously, their presentations just like they would if they were writing a paper, but adding in that video component has caused them to now really hone in on that actual presentation component, which I don't think that they always get if they're not having to record it. It also forces them to think about recording something and what that's going to look like even a week or 2 weeks later. I actually adapted, I had seen one of Peggy's courses and the whole here's me at the beach or doing something fun. And one of the things that we talk about is if you're going to talk about, let's say, a current event, I might not watch that until 3 months or whatever later if it's something that's being videotaped. And so they also learn to be conscious about the content that they use because they're forced to think about the fact that their speech isn't going to be live, and they have to consider how is it going to translate a week, 2 week, or even a year later. Questions?
Jessica, this, and to Bob, I always run into students who have that learning curve about the format that you're going to use. How much of an issue is this, and do you have to spend time teaching students to do that, or how to?
Yeah, a little bit. I think, just trying to teach them how to record properly becomes important. What does that look like? What does staging look like? But for the most part, I find that they pick it up. I also try to help them think about places where they can find the technology to make it easier. It's one thing to record on the cell phone, but if you've got a library close by, your church, there's somewhere that you can get a little bit more advanced equipment. And so I find that I try to focus on what's the equipment that you have available,
okay,
and then we can troubleshoot to what procedure you should use.
I just have a PowerPoint here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my course goals and how I try to meet that goal with an online course and different assignments. So the course is Religion and Politics in the United States.
Can you use the mic, Greg?
Yeah, sure. So the course is Religion and Politics in the United States, and one of my goals is to help students see the diversity of religious traditions in the country as well as the class. So there's several different ways I deal with that. One is the wiki, and after listening to Bob, I think I want to move to the Google wiki. So this is kind of clunky, and one of the reasons it doesn't work so well is students can change it and it kind of messes things up, and if you go to the wiki right now for this course, you'll see that things are messed up. But what I like about the idea of a wiki in general is students get a chance to see each other. And so one of the key concepts I want them to learn about is religious tradition and denomination. So I put in my own self here at the beginning, and I asked them to do the same thing. So after everyone's done, there'll be 25 or 30 students that have posted about their religious tradition and their denomination. And so I have two videos, one in which I describe how to complete a wiki, and the other where I describe, explain these concepts of religious tradition and denomination. And so we have a lot of evangelicals at Bethel, but after completing this, I think the students see that in their class, there are people from different religious traditions. There are mainline Protestants, there are black Protestants, people from different religious traditions. So that's been pretty effective, I think, in helping students see that. The second thing I use is discussion forums. And this is a screenshot of some of the postings for the discussion forum for Module 8. So there's 15 or 16 modules throughout the semester. And this module is about Christian Zionism, Roman Catholicism, and mainline Protestants. And I generally leave it open for the students. The only restriction is that they have to comment on material in that module. And sometimes they'll comment on the same things. In this particular case, one of the things that fascinated them was a prayer by the Bishop Gene Robinson, the Episcopal bishop. So sometimes you'll get some of that. But I think what you see on this screenshot too is a fair bit of diversity in comments on different religious traditions. They're commenting on each of those traditions. And they have to interact with each other. So one of the requirements is that they have an original post, and then they have to respond to 2 other posts from others in the class. And I know they're reading the posts because one of the other assignments is a learner essay, and in their learner essays they'll often refer to things other students are talking about. And they may say things like, I was surprised at students in this religious tradition, or how they were reacting to mainline Protestants. I disagree, I have a different view. So in general, I think the discussion forum is a good means for helping them see the differences in the class, but also their different reflections on these different religious traditions in the United States. So this is the third thing. I require students to do 7 learner essays in the course. I got this idea from Bob Kistler a number of years ago. And so here I give them a prompt, and this is the prompt. Which elements of the Christian, Zionist, Roman Catholic, and mainline Protestant political perspectives are most in keeping with your own Christian perspective on political life, and why? Which parts of these perspectives do you think evangelicals would endorse, and which parts might be more problematic for them, and why? And so I always try to get them to connect what they're learning to their own perceptions of religion and politics. And they do a really good job of that for the most part. And as I said a moment ago, they tend to incorporate some of the things they're reading about in the discussion forums as well. And then the fourth thing I have them do here is a research assignment. This is built into 2 parts. The first part requires them to examine their own religious tradition. And this is actually pretty useful. I find that a fair number of students aren't that familiar with their own religious tradition. They may think they go to a non-denominational church, but it's not actually a non-denominational church. So that's a useful activity, and I give them feedback on that. And then the second part is due at the end of the semester. And so hopefully they draw on the feedback that I give them for the first part and develop a good second part. So the second part, they have to do research on a different religious tradition that they're not familiar with. One of the requirements is that they attend a church in a different religious tradition. So an evangelical student, for instance, might attend a black Protestant church or a mainline Protestant church, and they're asked to observe any signs of political activity while they're there visiting a church, but then they also have to do research on that religious tradition. So this is something they work on individually, but one of the things I do to help them in the research is I have some narrated videos. So I have a couple of screenshots here of 2 that are important. One is the Association of Religion Data Archives. So I use, I think it's Screencast-O-Matic, And it's just a video of me clicking and explaining to them how to use this resource so they can learn about different religious traditions. Another really important resource for them is the Pew Forum on Religious Life, and this is a screenshot of the Religious Landscape Survey. Tons of really good data there, and for students who aren't necessarily familiar with their own religious tradition or other religious traditions, this is really useful. So again, I just click through things and say, this is where you find information about Baptists or mainline Protestants or Roman Catholics and so on. So the feedback I use, Turnitin and the originality reports, which is really useful. In fact, for part 1 of the assignment this semester, there were several students who had high percentages in their originality report. In other words, they were not properly citing. So I encourage them actually to run it through first and look at the results, and then they can resubmit it. You can do that. They don't always do that, but that's a good thing to do. And then the grade mark I find really helpful as well. You have these comments over here on the side. You can just click, you highlight some text, and click, and then students will see the comments. And then I also like using the rubric here, so this gives them good information, helps me to move through the assignments pretty quickly. I can just click on a number, and at the bottom you can apply the rubric percentage to the grade. It does all the calculations for you. And so between that and the other comments that I'll make, they get pretty good feedback on their assignments. So that was it. And then there's one other thing I was going to show. Do we have time to do that?
Yeah, a minute or two.
You're still Peggy.
You're still Peggy. Am I?
You're still Peggy.
Yeah.
You
Just
got
go up to
close
log
the
out.
browser.
The whole thing?
Log out.
Don't close.
Why don't we come back after Carole, maybe? Would that,
Sure.
would that work if we have time? Okay.
A couple of years ago, when we had the big push in CAS to try to create more online courses, it wasn't immediately obvious to me that I'd be able to go that route. I teach almost exclusively laboratory courses. But as I thought about it, and with lots of help from Bob, thank you, Bob, I did find that some laboratory courses that I teach might be open to this approach. And so I started with my cognitive psychology class. And so in cognitive psychology now, the laboratories, and in laboratory courses in general, you really have 2 objectives for the labs. You do, of course, want the students to get the main idea of the lab, get a better understanding of it, and through a kind of a process of discovery, okay? And then secondly, though, the students have to gain the skill in carrying out the procedures and the methodology while they're doing the lab. So you have to make sure that both of these things can happen in the exercise of the lab. And so that does lead to kind of the particular challenges for teaching labs online. But cognitive psychology worked for that because the apparatus, I mean, your first problem, of course, is getting the apparatus into the student's hands, whatever it is. If it's glassware in a chemistry lab, then you'd have to figure out a way to get the glassware into their hands. But in cognitive psychology, it's computers, almost exclusively these days. We do almost all of our research on computers. So the next challenge that you have then, after I realized I could probably get, they all have their computers, they can do these things online, then you have to make sure that you can do it safely, because obviously, in other types of labs, you actually have to do them in the laboratory because some of the materials and things are not safe, and so your professor's got to be there. In this case, there's also a little bit of a safety issue. As I began to discover that I could have them do procedures online and where those procedures were coming from, then I realized I did have to be kind of careful about what websites and things and procedures I was giving them to do. So I have just some examples here of what I found for them to do to illustrate this. So one approach that does work well, as long as you don't need very precise and careful timing of things, is to use PowerPoints. And so this particular example lab here, where they're going to carry out a procedure to observe serial position effects, used a PowerPoint program that I created and had them go to and use. And the only trick here, and the biggest problem, is that in these PowerPoints, I never did discover, maybe this has been fixed now, Bob, how to get the actual show with all the timings and everything in it to download properly from Moodle. So I still have to go this route where they actually open up the presentation and then ask to view it as a show. And so this one looks like this, and then you have to tell them on your opening page here, so that they get the whole procedure, to open it as a show and look at it. Do that. Anyway, so these things, of course, they're very familiar with already, so they can get these programs and they can download them and watch them for themselves. And there's no fears there of there's no fears there then of anything, any malware getting into what they download, as long as you're sure of what you've given them to download. But if you need more precise timings in the procedure, timing of presentations of stimuli or timing of response times that people have to things, then I've found that I have to go to other websites where more highly developed programs are placed. And fortunately, there are a number of these in cognitive psychology, and I was able to trust them. I'll just show you one more quick example here of one that I like. So this laboratory, which has participants searching through very brief presentations of a visual display for a particular target, and then is measuring how quickly they can detect the target by hitting a key. And this one is created by this wonderful little website here called Go Cognitive. But you have to make sure that you can trust these sites before you send your people to them to do them. But there are many more of these being created all the time. I'm really amazed at how much is out there. And once I started searching around for them, I found plenty of good ones and plenty of safe ones. And just this year, the final thing that I added was Qualtrics too. I found that I could do some of the procedures that I needed them to do by creating a little Qualtrics service and then just give them the link, and then they could go to it and do it. Your next challenge in actually getting the procedures into their hands then is making sure that they can do them on their own, that they're not going to need too much more supervision from you. And so this means really good instructions. So you write up your instructions, although in this way, I have to admit that the students turned out to be better at doing this than I thought they would be. And when I was doing labs with them face-to-face, I kind of discovered that actually I was telling them more and giving them more guidance than I needed to, and which pleased me very much because they do read the instructions very well. You can tell them where to go, and then the programs that run will tell them what they're supposed to do with it and how they're supposed to make their responses and all that kind of thing. And they will do this very well. And so I was pleasantly surprised by that. One other thing that I will mention, though, about doing the labs in this particular course, it did turn out to be necessary that we do them all together, time-wise. So this would not be an online course that a student could sign up for and then just do the assignments whenever they want, way out in advance or something like that. I did have to assign the laboratory exercises each week and have them all do it together, because then your data are handled, your data are generated by the participants themselves, and that's what I'll show you next then is how do you figure out if they are getting what they need to get out of them. And so I use a couple of different approaches to assessing whether they're doing this right. Actually, I want to show you one more thing before I leave this example right here. I think this is one. Oh no, it's not. Hang on. Still the wrong one. Now you do have to have them handle their own data, and this was the other thing I was a little concerned as to whether they would be able to do okay on their own once they've collected it. And here again I was pleasantly surprised because I did find that I could send them to a Google spreadsheet and let them all edit it. Now, my fears, of course, was that this would turn into chaos, but actually it didn't. They did pretty well on that. And here again, instructions are pretty important. If you emphasize to them up front that how to put their own data into the data file, then we actually had very minimal problems with them messing up what somebody else had entered. And that was kind of a thing I was concerned about, but that actually works quite well. So here's the instruction that I gave them. Just said, enter your, and it won't open up for me right when I'm logged on here, but enter your data into this Google file, and here's how you do it, and you put it on one line of the data file, and each column is labeled so they know what score they're supposed to put in each column, etc. And that worked fine too. So then you have to analyze what they're doing with it, or assess what they're doing with it, and whether they're getting out of it what they should be getting out of it. And again, there's a couple different ways that I went about doing this. For most of the labs, then I've got a class results page then, which after the data are collected, I usually do most of the analysis, but I have them look at the data. Now the problem was that even though these students have had their basic statistics course, it's not that they won't know what to do with those. Well, they will know how to run the procedures, but they won't necessarily know how to apply them to this particular data set. And that part, I didn't feel like then I could assign to them to all try to do it, figure out what analysis to do. So I do the analysis of the data afterward then, and I post it for them then in an extra page in the Moodle course. And it comes up then a couple of days after their data have all been due and they're supposed to have turned and put them into the Google Sheet, that I can have them look at the data file then and see what it looks like, and then I can show them the results of the analysis that we performed. And then I post it on a sheet like this, on a page, where I give them pretty much the basics of what we found, and let them then at that point interpret what they mean, what the results mean. Usually, the assessment then is done with a worksheet, although I have them write 2 full lab reports, but the worksheets can be sometimes the place in which they have to manage their data, and sometimes the, this page 2 over here. And then wrapping up with thinking it through questions. So if you want to figure out whether they actually did get the main idea that they should have gotten, then you have to ask them questions that ask them to work with the data, not just to reiterate some principles that they read in their book. How I do that is with these kinds of thought questions where it will require that they may perhaps pose a hypothesis and then evaluate whether this is what our data supported, was this the hypothesis that was supported, and things like that. So you kind of get that feel as to, and if they understood what the lab was about and what it was showing, they can answer these kinds of questions quite well. I'll stop, but I have more. Which I'm also happy to share with anybody else who would like to know.
I think we're going to wrap up here. Let's give a round of applause. Feel free to talk with any of them individually about specific things, or maybe you had ideas sparked too. Thanks, everybody.